Welcome everyone to another episode of the Thrivalist Manifesto with Dr. G and Ben V. We're both very excited about today's guest. Today's guest is a personal friend as well as a colleague for many years, and his specialty is in biochemistry and nutrition. We'll learn more about his education in a second here, but Robert is a clinical researcher, a scientist, a clinical practitioner who's retired now, an entrepreneur, and just a maverick in the field of biochemistry and nutrition. So welcome to the show, Robert. Thank you so much for being here.
It is such a pleasure. Ben, thank you so much. Dr. G, absolute pleasure. I really appreciate your gentleman's time.
Thanks, buddy. So Robert, tell us a little bit about, just so the audience knows, tell us a little bit about your background. And it's a really interesting story how you came into the field of biochemistry and nutrition, because you're a musician and a fellow New Yorker, and it's a super interesting story every time that I hear it.
I appreciate that, Ben. Thank you. And as I said, honored to be here with you guys. So, sometimes it takes a personal experience to move someone in a career direction. And yes, my first passion and my love was drums. And I think it appealed to me rhythmically, mathematically, on every level you could imagine. Just being able to play ostinatos and have different limbs do different things, I found incredibly intriguing. And I was a student of all these great drummers. And if I may name drop, one of my heroes to this day is the great Neil Peart.
Yes.
Who they call the professor.
Yes.
So while I was adroit in science from grammar school and grade school going up, you could not take drums away from me. It actually took a disease to change my path. So and this became a passion that I hope there's just a little bit of time for me to talk about in my research I'm doing at Rutgers.
Absolutely.
But what transpired was I developed a cardiovascular disorder and a seizure disorder as my primary symptoms. Really, that is not the symptoms. So I want to keep the listeners and you hanging on for a minute. Ben, you know the actual truth.
Yes.
So as you can imagine, there was a lot of soul searching there. Here I am. I have atrial fibrillation and I'm barely 18 years old. My stroke risk is now 75% if you look at the data at that age. I started developing VTAC at the same exact time. My resting heart rate out of nowhere could go over 200. The highest I was clocked at in a medical office after having a seizure episode, was 222 beats per minute. Doctors were petrified. Needless to say, I was extremely overly medicated. And it was an extremely frightening period in my life. So as you can imagine, the drumsticks had to be put down because I played my favorite Rush songs. And you're not going to do that with a resting heart rate faster than the metronome.
Right. Right. And for the audience, so the audience knows, for someone that age, that's probably 4 to 5 times what their resting heart rate should be.
Yeah, and that's your specialty, and that's where I really wanted to get that across. So it was a very frightening situation. Doctors did not know what to do with me. I did not come from a huge academic background with parents. My father, God rest his soul, was a post office employee in Chelsea. My mother was a bank teller at Union Square, where they had Chase Manhattan. I think now it's a Whole Foods. How New York changes. So the median income they had was like $17,000 for family. I just have a brother, family of 4 at the time, and medical care wasn't really there. Mm-hmm. Another piece of the puzzle was my father passed away of prostate cancer at a very early age. In 1986, he was 50 years old, and he died in February of that year. So I later found out that was a huge piece to my medical puzzle. But getting to the punchline, I saw some of the greatest doctors you could imagine. I mean, a friend of mine drove me to Massachusetts General, where I saw one of the best cardiovascular researchers and medical doctors at the time. He just was on a 2020 episode with Barbara Walters. We hung out at his office, camped out until I would be seen. I ended up seeing him. Everybody was vexed by my case. They did not know what to do except just treat me with medication, palliative care. I was on 13 different drugs. The worst of which for me was a combination of Serpacil, if you guys remember Reserpine. Mm-hmm. It was banned because it had a very high incidence of suicide rate associated with it. It's an alpha blocker. That was combined with Inderol, a beta blocker, and Tenormin. So that combination basically made me feel like I was at a Grateful Dead concert around the clock, but my brain was trying to follow the drum track for Red Barchetta for moving pictures. So I was trapped in a zombified. It was just a horrendous experience. Again, being an astute reader, even though it was a long shot, I was getting all these gum sores. I was losing teeth. I ate a bagel and broke teeth in my mouth. And I went to my doctor's office and I said it would be really great if I could be tested for food-based diseases. And the only one I could find in the medical textbooks is this thing called celiac disease. Would you test me? And he said, this is extremely rare. I can't imagine that being anything you would have. So no. So being a boy from Queens, I just, when he left the room, peeled off the top layer of his prescription pad, and I ordered all my own blood work, and I walked into a walk-in blood clinic, handed this prescription pad order, and I had a full battery of testing for celiac disease. I ended up having off the charts for the technology they had at the time, tissue transglutaminase, antigliadin antibodies. Well, maybe not the best ones and best testing at the time. I can remember that a cutoff range was like 25 and I was 172, like so unbelievably insanely high. And needless to say, the lab called the physician, and the physician was like agape and in shock and embarrassed. And I went in for an emergency biopsy, and I had absolutely obliterated villi. I did not have villi. So as you both could imagine, what was the next thing that happened? Well, he went to his medical textbook, and this I'll never forget. It's tattooed in my brain. He tore out the page on what he thought was the treatment for celiac disease, which was only nutritional. There's no medications. And all I was thinking at the time was, what about the next guy? Right. If he ripped it really showed to me just how much he did not give a damn. But hell, this guy already stole my prescription pad. I better give him something. He should have gave me the whole textbook. Right. So I ended up following this gluten-free diet, and within about 20 days, I was rushed to the emergency room being overdosed on cardiovascular medication because it was the first time I ever absorbed anything. So the doses that they required to normalize my heart rhythm and bring it down from the 200s to 150 and maybe down to 97 had me go all the way down into the 50s and bradycardia levels. And I was in an emergency room, and the department is thinking maybe this guy overdosed. And the puzzle pieces are coming to my drugged state. Oh my goodness, I'm actually absorbing things. And it also explained that I looked like a just wasted away ectomorph. 140 pounds soaking wet, 138 pounds soaking wet, 28-inch waist at 6'2", just a mess. Mm-hmm. And so that really was just such a huge wake-up call for me. And I went through a huge battle of trying to get my body back, trying to get my life back, trying to figure out what I was going to do. Obviously, music kind of left me. The passion was always there, but that old gene of science in my head came roaring back and fought my way back to health and went back to undergrad, where I dropped out to pursue a music career, even with a 4.0, which can you imagine the shock in my family? I then went back and secured my undergrad in science and took everything you could, so much so that I am sure I had a lopsided resume and my actual transcript, because I did not take one art class. I just took every mathematics, any neuroscience, any nutrition, anatomy, physiology, anything you could take that was medical based was my passion. I was thinking of pursuing the path to be a medical doctor. My health was still not great because there were so many secondary, like many people with my disease, celiac disease, so many secondary medical conditions that were associated with that. And I also found that, you're a hell of a researcher. If I was given a task to write a paper or do a stain sample on cells, I would really make that my own and own it. And went on to pursue the path towards PhD-dom and actually be a researcher. So I ended up finding my way, much like Ben did, but in a slightly different path. Ben would find his heroes in physiology and body work and mechanics. And it could be a doctor, it could be a neurologist, it could be someone from the Olympics. Ben would show up at their doorstep, do a residency, do an internship with them, and get a phenomenal education in addition to his academics. I found my academic heroes and said, now where are they? Mm-hmm. And did reverse engineered what paper was done and said, I got to study with this guy. And I ended up at Eastern Michigan University, where I completed my graduate education in human nutrition with a core personal focus on nutrigenomics, because my disease is genetic. Mm-hmm. So I'm a double carrier for DQ2 and DQ8 genes. I have this proclivity to have this disease, and unfortunately, as will my offspring, I have one daughter, and she has a greater increased risk of having the disease, having a parent who has the disease. And we found out only a couple of months ago, my incredibly healthy wife is a genetic carrier for one of these celiac genes, though she does not manifest the condition. So my daughter really has this extreme risk. What's so fascinating about that, and I think Ben will tell you, me being a student of science is always going to be bigger than anyone will ever be, and I worship at the temple of science. So I found myself to just never give up studying, and went into a PhD program at Rutgers. My honor society from Eastern Michigan University is Phi Kappa Phi, and Phi Kappa Phi is always pursuing higher learning and education, and they turned me on to this cutting edge program in biomedical informatics, nanomedicine, and clinical informatics. And it's really just probably the most interesting field you could possibly study. For me, passionately, because it is precision medicine for the individual. Biomedical informatics is going down not only to the gene, studying the proteomics of how the gene is actually even made to begin with, how RNA is even manufactured, and how there's isoforms of that manufacturing process that could be problematic and could be the difference between why someone can smoke for 60, 70 years and never get lung cancer, and one person never smokes at all but just lives in a city where they're exposed to so much secondhand smoke that they develop the worst stage of lung cancer. So I was really fascinated with why my disease did this to me, and it made me want to become a biochemical detective for other diseases. As Ben mentioned, in between all that, I practiced for about 18 years and had the pleasure of seeing so many different clients in my practice. And it was always that sleuthing component. What can I do different? Can I do an organic acid analysis to measure X, Y, and Z? But it really was genetics. And that's really where I found my home, was in research at Rutgers. And yay, Big Ten school, so I still keep sports alive. but the academic, they outspend Yale and Harvard and Northwestern, if I may quote what's in the New Jersey press. They have a phenomenal team, and the professors that I have are second to none.
The New Jersey press is definitely the original fake media.
Yeah, so it has been probably the most enlightening experience of my life. So if I could close the cycle on that story, what I have done is I created what's known as a clinical decision support system. There's a hero of mine in prostate cancer research named Dr. Antonina Mitrofanova. And yes, she sounds like a James Bond villain. I'm aware of that. She looks like she could be a Bond girl, and she's also absolutely academically brilliant. So I was following her career at Columbia, and she did her work in quantifiable prostatic cancer analogies and started looking at all the mathematic predictability behind prostate cancer. Her research led me to the strong association between celiac disease and that disease, and that led me to hiring prostatic oncologists that then found out reverse engineering. My father was more than likely an undiagnosed celiac, God rest his soul, and Antonina set up shop at Rutgers, and I'm happy to report she's not only one of my favorite professors, she's on my dissertation committee for my doctoral work at Rutgers, and I'm also happy to report that I got a 4.0 in everybody's work, but of course in her classes. So she introduced me to artificial intelligence and using advanced mathematics and capabilities to program machinery to think the way humans would think and reduce the margin for error and get expeditiously towards a diagnosis. So marrying biomedicine and everything you could learn to to be a really wise researcher and doctor with the nanomedicine side, which is using nanotechnology to make medicine smaller and hit their target more expeditiously, along with the programmability side of learning languages like Python and Essex Corvid, so that you could turn this knowledge into a super brain. And that's basically what I did on a small level with my research. I had led up at the Mayo Clinic. One of my chairs on my dissertation is the great Dr. Joseph Murray. He's been a hero of mine since 1999 when I read his first paper when he was at Trinity College in Ireland. He runs the gastroenterology and celiac wing at Mayo Clinic for, at least 10 years. And I just read everything he ever wrote, and I wanted him on my team. And we shared my algorithm with major universities throughout the U.S., and we actually had it graded and voted. And if I may go back to my Queen's roots, they beat the hell out of it to make sure it really had value. And I'm happy to report that it had wonderful value, and I presented that data shortly after Thanksgiving over at Rutgers to a nice round of applause. So it made me feel very good that hopefully I could leave a mark on this planet and save people from the path that I had to take. You gentlemen may be interested to know that 83% of individuals with celiac disease will never receive a diagnosis, and they are not diagnosed.
That's an amazing number. Wow.
So Robert, that was a mouthful, by the way. I mean, you just brought us through a loop in your life that I think would take a while to unpack, but I want to get started. Sure. So on the celiac side, so much from the 1980s, you would think now doctors would be a lot more aware of what's going on, and there's still some weird diagnostic algorithms or criteria that doctors have that don't seem to make any sense. For example, we had a 6-year-old girl where her, tissue transglutaminase came up positive. Her gluten antibodies came up positive, but very positive, right? The antibodies were all there. But the definitive diagnosis for celiac requires the visualization of the villi in the small intestines to be blunted. And, a 6-year-old girl who's probably just starting to manifest the disease, her villi are probably going to look fine. And the fear that I have is here's somebody whose blood is telling you she is not responding well to gluten and has all of the blood markers to say she has celiac disease. However, until they see blunted villi, they may not give her the definitive diagnosis, and the blunted villi is actually end-stage disease where you're not absorbing nutrients. So waiting for the child to get sick to get a definitive diagnosis later in life is ridiculous, and it all seems to be done under the banner of, well, we don't want to make her feel different in school because she can't eat gluten. And it makes you want to scream. It actually makes you want to punch somebody in the face. If I could go back to my Queen's roots, right? So what are your thoughts on the state of educating our medical, and not just medical, but even alternative medicine to better understand not only celiac, but also gluten sensitivity?
That's an excellent point. And I want to mention, I want to cover everything you stated, but I'd like to start first with, there are stages known as Marsh stages that are from 0 to 4. So with the utmost respect, but perhaps we shouldn't have the utmost respect if we're bringing in our Queens and Bronx and our boroughs into the house here.
Yes.
I really think this is a very, very poor managed case by the gastroenterologist on call, because there are ways to see very small infiltrate that there is absolutely no damage to the villi yet, but a solid, knowledgeable gastroenterologist, for example, under Murray's teachings at the Mayo Clinic, a resident would catch this and say, they're Marsh 1 celiac. Now, that's just one point. So I would ask the parents to take those slides, never torture the 6-year-old, send those actual 13 biopsies, which is like the gold standard, the 12, 13, 15 biopsy samples, to someone as knowledgeable as the Mayo Clinic department so they could actually get a better view and make a better diagnosis. Having said that, there is this real interesting move in Europe, and it's getting a lot of backing from some prominent groups to make a diagnosis of celiac disease in specific pediatric groups that meet serological criteria and genome criteria. So this child needs to have already done a DQ2 and DQ8 genetic testing. If that's positive, and then they're tenfold higher for specific markers. And I would recommend an endomysial antibody analysis where you're using like the monkey tissue, which has a phenomenal specificity and sensitivity for diagnosis, right? You want this specificity to say, we are so certain this is celiac, it's like bananas. We got like a 98.9% specificity, and you want the sensitivity to open the floodgate to let the person towards that path so the doctor's aware of it to do that type of testing. So what I'm trying to do with my work is twofold. First, educate. The most groundbreaking, shocking paper I read, all in my research time at Rutgers, was McCormick from Georgetown. I had to get her on the phone after reading her paper. It was a poster presentation at the American College of Gastroenterology 1 year after the American College of Gastroenterology said, here is the Bible on how to diagnose celiac disease. Read it, learn it, know it, have a good conference. I'll see y'all next year. She then said, 10 months in, just prior to the next symposium, I'm going to send out a survey to X many of these doctors, and I'm going to ask them questions about how to diagnose celiac disease and find out what happened. And it was miserable. It was so abysmal. I used it as part of my defense as to why I'm doing my research. It was shocking how many doctors just had no clue. How many doctors would think, we could just tell them to kind of avoid gluten. Or there was even 9% of the doctors said, you know what? You don't even have to worry about your diet. Let's use steroids every time you have a symptom. So it's going back to the square one of force educating these physicians. And that's why I got into the computer science of this, so that it becomes an accepted educational module while you're running live cases or you're running fake cases or older cases, and you're learning as you go. And at the end of this whole part of this thinking brain to help you make a better clinical decision of the symptomatology section, you're learning, and it spits out this whole, these were secretory immunoglobulin IgA deficiency symptoms, which 15% of the population of celiac disease has a higher risk of having SIgA. So if you're measuring SIgA in a patient, you're going to come up falling short.
Understood.
And I could go on for hours just on that one topic, because there's so many nuances and paths and quick turns like Ben boxing. These quick little adjustments you have to make, or you're going to get knocked out the wrong way with your patient not getting diagnosed.
So, Robert, let me ask you, again, just sticking to the celiac story, because I think it's very relevant and you're obviously passionate about it. So with regards to being diagnosed with celiac, can you explain to our listeners what exactly is happening immunologically in them? So they're sensitive to a molecule that we call gluten, which is a protein found in wheat. It's technically a lectin, actually a weak type of lectin, but it's still a lectin. And explain what's happening in the immune system when celiac disease is present.
Sure. So what happens in the patient who has celiac disease is when they consume this normally innocuous substance known as gluten and glutenin and gliadin that's found within this protein, it stimulates an immune system reaction. And this immune system reaction is driven and governed by a genetic manifestation that pushes the immune system. The substance and the antibody response is tagged by a DQ2 and DQ8 genetic manifestation, which calls in the troops, and it sends in an immunological response that will start to create inflammation, attacking your own tissues. It's an autoimmune disease, but it also causes, there's this substance inside our intestinal tight junction cells known as CXC3, and it stimulates a release of a peptide called zonulin. And in this immunological reaction in the celiac patient, these normal tight junction cells separate ever so slightly, kind of like moving apart cards if you laid them flat on a magician's table, and that really thin line spills this immunological antibody reaction of the gluten peptide and the human immune system throughout the celiac disease person's system, and it can land anywhere. It could get into the thyroid and become Hashimoto's thyroiditis or Graves' disease. It can get into lymphatic tissue and stimulate systemic lupus erythematosus. It could be in the prostate tissue or breast tissue and be associated with various morphological changes there that may or may not be precancerous, but there needs to be more attention to the disease state there. So there's this just omnipresent generation of immune system burden that is localized and disseminated in the celiac disease patient once there's this consumption of the gluten. And there is no safe level. I can't make that clear enough. I don't know if you were with me, Ben. We were at Quality Meats, and there was a tiny little breadcrumb on the back of an asparagus that was almost going in my mouth. And my wife was like, slow motion, no! Because that tiny amount, a grain of salt for our listeners, could absolutely send me into an immunological reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the general consensus that you get when you talk to, even my athletes at a high level is that it's over-exaggerated. And then, I can have a little bit. And I'm like, no, you can't have anything that contains gluten. Zero. And it's really important that they understand that the response is immediate and the response is dire.
I'm so glad you brought up athletes, because I really wanted to get there. The biggest thing I noticed in athletes that I have found are celiac, right? Because let's just do a generality and say it's 1 out of 100 people. Now let's pretend the three of us are at a proper football stadium in, let's say, Manchester United, right? And we're hanging out and we just look around that stadium and we say, let's go to 100 and get to 101 and say, let's put a red dot on them, and then zoom out and take a look at that playing field of how many people probably have celiac disease. The thing I see in young athletes is bone fractures, early onset bone fractures that are hidden by the sport. They're immediately said, oh, you know what, well, did you see that? The guy is so massive, he collided with him. Really would not have happened in the absence of this disease. So you have these bone morphological changes that are extremely deleterious. They are measurable. You see them. There's so many markers you could actually see, not even including a DEXA scan, of course, but where you see, wow, this person has old bones, but they just happen to be genetically, just how I was genetically predisposed to have this disease. You could have a massive 6'5" linebacker that's built like a tank, but have horrendous bones. And in a DEXA scan, they look like they're in their mid-60s, and they're more prone for fracture. So I really see that Darwinism comes into play, and our Achilles heel are forms that fit their function. So if it's an ice skater with celiac disease, she's probably going to have more risk with her ankles than my cardiovascular history. Right? I was beating the crap out of my heart the way I was beating my drums like they owed me money. So it was. So that's where I was really putting all my risks, which I think is a very interesting topic in and of itself. And I'm most frightened of the demographics and the lack of attention in specific subgroups in our culture. You know, I'm blessed to live in a melting pot, grow up in a melting pot. I feel that it's the only way to understand ourselves and our sociological perspective. It gives us a better view on medicine and lack of care. There are 42,000 pediatric deaths to celiac disease happening in Asia and Africa per year.
That's amazing.
And just nobody's doing anything about that. This is a very serious disease that leads to death. Make no bones about it. And no pun on bones with the skeletal system. But what I find also troubling is when I was in clinical practice, the cases I first started seeing weren't the ones I was looking for. You don't always catch what you're fishing for, right? So I'm fishing. I'm casting a massive net, trying to keep my sensitivity of my practice large enough to get a better specificity of who has the disease. But I had patients come in, Dr. Pastore, I was referred to you by Columbia Department of Gastroenterology because I'm recovering from small bowel cancer. And I had this section of my small intestine removed. And, can I see your pathology reports? Yeah, because I just want to know, the IV nutrition versus oral nutrition. I want to get a full scope here. How much was removed? How much can you digest? Are you aware The pathology report, of course, confirmed your intestinal cancer, but you have celiac disease. Oh, yeah, but the doctor said that's no longer a concern because I no longer have that section of my small intestine that reacts immunologically.
Oh, my God. Yeah. And Robert, right now, what's the research showing if you take the general population, what percentage are coming back genetically predisposed with the DQ genes?
We don't have enough. Well, this breaks my heart to say this to you. We don't have enough data. The data we have is looking at the largest portion is about 1 out of 100 of us. I think there's subgroups that have a higher risk. Having Italian genes, there seems to be a higher risk, potentially 1 out of 80, 1 out of 88. We always thought the Irish had one of the highest genes, and that's where my colleague and academic hero, Dr. Joseph Murray, hails from, and said that ended up not being the case. There's more of a norm. But what I want to do more work on to get those answers, Ben, is looking at blood banks that have stored data. So there was a really interesting military study where doctors were able to get access to blood that was drawn in the 50s. And they found 1,503 cases of celiac disease out of 10,000 blood-drawn subjects. But there was no cases ever diagnosed until they had this blood. Now, obviously, a lot of these military men have passed, right?
Right.
And that's sad and unfortunate. But who knows what diseases and conditions and manifestations they had that really were celiac disease, but they were being treated for something that wasn't their primary disease. They needed that treatment. But could it be like me? For the listeners in the audience, I turn 49 this year, and knock on wood, I haven't been on a cardiovascular medication since I was 20. And I pass all my heart tests with flying colors and have a normal resting heart rate, and I can run on a treadmill and all those things and pass the stress test. It really is proof is in the pudding, right? Treating that primary disease was the cause of my secondary disease, which was thought was my primary disease. I think we have a lot of that in society, and also not giving it enough time. There was one great paper that came out that it takes around 5 years to fully heal the intestines from a diagnosis of celiac disease. So can you imagine how impaired this patient is? You're not seeing someone like Dr. G who's concerned about your nutritional status. Perhaps you're at a regular doctor's office, and bless their heart, they found your disease. They're not worried about your vitamin D, your B12, your folic acid. Do you have a polymorphism of your folic acid utilization? What's all your vitamin and mineral status? So they let you leave, and you're left potentially with 5 years of B12 deficiency.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because so many of our patients, especially female patients who are diagnosed with anemia, whether it be a megaloblastic anemia where their red blood cells are too big because of a B12 deficiency, or whether it be an iron deficiency anemia where their red blood cells are too small. And, it's just amazing how nonchalant our medical profession is when it comes to anemia. Anemia is something that disrupts your ability to deliver oxygen. It's kind of, you'd think that would be at very high up there, and B12 and iron are actually absorbed in the small intestines in an area where that is largely affected by celiac disease. So one question I have for you, so if the antibodies that are made to the gluten molecule, the gluten protein, the gliadin, those are the same antibodies that are actually resulting in an attack on the small intestinal tissue. So that would be the autoimmune. So it's kind of like a cross reaction. Is that similar to how antibodies to strep can also become antibodies to heart valve tissue? Is it the same cross reaction kind of an episode?
Yeah, it's very similar, and it's something I would categorize as molecular mimicry, right? So there's this antibody response that's very similar, and another example would be type 1 diabetes, where there's an autoimmune attack on the islet cells of Langerhans that would normally produce insulin, and they get attacked. And that's why type 1 diabetes is considered a primary risk factor in celiac disease, because that coupling of the antibody-antigen response can look very similar to the tissue that is on the pancreas, resulting in that autoimmune genesis. So it is very similar.
So then how serious is this gluten immune response if there is no attack on small intestinal tissue, but there's a molecular mimicry to, let's say, brain tissue or pancreatic tissue or some other tissue that results in an autoimmunity? Can it be a primary gluten problem, and is anybody looking at that?
Well, in actual celiac disease, and I don't know if we're going back to this young child's case, if I may be so bold, with those types of blood analysis, and of course I haven't seen them, and making sure, let's just throw it out there, that they're verified and they're CLIA licensed laboratory blood testing analysis accepted by the FDA Mayo Clinic, and they're showing strong positives, I would argue that there is more than likely some type of intestinal abnormality that's occurring. It's probably being missed by the gastroenterologist that is reviewing it, or pathology that's reviewing that, and just wanted to throw that out there. At any level, there's a risk for, and this is where I love the work of Dr. Alessio Fasano. If anyone is a fan of Dr. Fasano out of University of Maryland, I've read everything he's written. He's probably the biggest proponent of zonulin research. I hope to do clinical research with him in the future, because I feel we're going to get more answers to that, because he's looking at another separate condition, not to throw a curveball into this dialogue, of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or whatever you want to call it. The nomenclature's not there yet. Non-celiac gluten intolerance. Those are looking like absolute real entities based on peer-reviewed published data, where there are measurements that we can see. Now, what I am hoping is with the advent of nanomedicine and biomedical informatics, where we can see things on a smaller scale and we can be more accurate, that we will see the unseen. I'd like to think right now a lot of the no shouldn't mean no, let's look somewhere else. It means no, we need better glasses. Very, very briefly on that, one of the projects I did for a Rutgers research is with a brilliant doctor named Dr. Goel. So Dr. Goel's a PhD, and Ben would just lose his mind hanging out with him because all his current work is in concussions.
Wow.
Fully funded work. And he shows how neurotransmission is being, normally that would be internal, is pushed completely towards the outside of the brain. There's a complete pause and a reset period that is required regardless of what modalities are being utilized. But getting to the point, working with Dr. Goel, I took active, real brain tumors and wrote a program for a technology known as MATLAB, which I just call MATLAB, being a boy from Queens, and wrote a algorithm that would mathematically make me be able to dissect these tumors more rapidly and actually have it automated. So I had this program I wrote, and it ran like 900,000 lines of code and could see smaller, better margins of these tumors that would take a longer time to see. So my point is, I think we could be a lot better in our analyses. Now, there's some cutting-edge research using 4K types of diagnostic tools when you have a camera and you're inside. There's which is just a higher resolution for the audience that may not know. There's amazing data on using blue stain to see the different in the folds and the scallops that transpire when you see towards the obliteration of celiac disease and the villi. But please let me be redundant for a moment. There's scales in this Marsh analyses where they go all the way up, and there's 6 different measurements until you get the end stage. So there are 6 opportunities of years of risk. Something as simple as just seeing infiltrate of the immunological antigen response inside the lining of the mucosal tissue, which should trigger any knowledgeable gastroenterologist to say something's fishy here.
But would the gastroenterologist, let's just say there's all of the markers serologically come up for gluten sensitivity, they far exceed the numbers. Maybe their genetic profile is not definitive as far as having 2 parents, with the DQ. But wouldn't it be wise to say, okay, it appears that you're sensitive to gluten. There's no evidence of celiac, but you should get off of gluten. Is that something that, especially now that we know there's other tissues that there can become a cross-reaction with, or molecular mimicry, where you can become autoimmune in some other aspect, right? If we take all of the autoimmune disorders out there and add them up, they far exceed any other disease process that we have. And of course, many autoimmune disorders are quite benign. But still, autoimmunity is far and away the most common human ailment when it comes to chronic disease. Wouldn't it be wise to just say, look, your antibodies for gluten are telling us that your immune system does not tolerate this molecule. Get it out of your diet.
And I have to tell you, I'm going to give you an interesting answer. When I practiced, absolutely without a shadow of a doubt, I could not go to sleep that night if I did not alert the individual I was talking to, any one of their physicians that would give me the time of day in writing, supply the evidence, and also make a referral so that I show non-bias. I was always thinking like a researcher even when I practiced, right? Mm-hmm. I can't show bias. So yes, I would blow the horn and say, this is just not a logical thing to do, and it'd be really wise not to do that. And there's evidence of that in the media, right? I mean, there's a publication in the Washington Post where it says, Dr. Pastore told an athlete on the Washington Nationals to stop eating gluten for this reason. There's a publication in the Arizona Sun that said, Dr. Pastore told this ex-Yankee that's not a Diamondback, don't eat gluten. He found that you shouldn't eat gluten. Poor Dr. Pastore. And I could name about 15 papers that said I was the bad guy with regard to taking gluten away from people. And I sleep at night because to me it makes complete scientific sense. The scientist side and the researcher side on me wants to see all the data and worries about the risk of these people not getting a full diagnosis. And what does that mean to their psyche? Will they leave this forever? Will they go from Dr. G, it's 20 years later, no longer care because no one scared the crap out of them and said this is a real lifelong diagnosis? Case in point, I worked in internal medicine. I saw a young man who was planning on getting married. He was told by me, the medical doctor who ran the practice and went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine, our nursing staff, and a secondary gastroenterologist outside our practice, you should avoid gluten because these tests were FDA academically sound and you're rejecting a biopsy. So you're rejecting the recommendation for a biopsy. You're going to leave this practice. We want you to avoid gluten. I put it all in writing, dotted my I's, crossed my T's. We were a teaching hospital, so I was very, very careful. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm in private practice. My wife is running my practice. I say, well, my next client looks really, this is a very familiar looking name. In walks this guy. He's a little bit salt and pepper hair now. He's got a little baby girl with him. He's got his wife with him. Congratulations, hugs. Do you remember me? Oh, Dr. P, yeah, I remember you. By the way, this is not a great visit. I wish it was just me seeing you again. I have multiple sclerosis. I felt like I was a ping pong ball. This is his exact words. It haunts me to this day. It's one of the reasons I had to leave practice was I wanted to make a change on an academic level. And this case gives me the chills. He said, I have MS, and I see him walking not great, and he's got a cane. And he said, my doctor told me that all the data that you presented had no value, and I continued along my gluten-free diet, and now I'm ready to listen. Now, some case in point, my father, rest his soul, sometimes too late is too late. I'm a miracle. You know, I was told flat out by cardiologists, you could have had a stroke any minute with your AFib that bad. I mean, I had an AFib event. I had 3 in a minute on average when they did a 24 Holter monitor, and then I had a 72-hour Holter monitor, and I just never was out of AFib. So, what did I do to this young man? I immediately pulled out Rodrigo's studies, who I quote in my doctoral research at Rutgers, and I say, look at this, there was an 11 times identification of celiac disease in multiple sclerosis patients. 11 times!
Wow.
How much more bang the drum going back to the drums. Evidence do you need?
Right.
So, I just want to say that while I hear you and I agree with you, I think a lot of people need a definitive diagnosis. That's number one. And Dr. Murray would be proud of me saying these things. I just want to say that. The next thing is what we could miss. So when I looked at the European model of the 6-year-old girl and I told you, which I'm not saying I disagree with, I'm saying I want better tools, better diagnostics. Let's invent a nano camera that the child can't even see, that's dispensed in distilled water, like a teardrop, that they pee out or poop out, no harm to the body whatsoever, and I can get a perfect visual look at what's going on in their villi and microvilli without trauma to the child, but I could also see things that we could potentially miss. There's secondary changes to the microbiota that have been published that you only see if we got a biopsy in celiac disease that can cause a whole host of other problems. There's data where you can have something as simple as H. pylori in a patient that finally got a biopsy that's present in a higher risk in patients who have celiac disease that would be missing. There's the selfish scientist in me that says, there's strong evidence for getting this tissue sample to tissue bank that and get more genomes. Right now, we're looking at the potential of 40 new SNPs to identify my disease while there are only DQ2 and DQ8. So this is a very rapid moving pathway towards diagnostics that getting the biopsies help. So
let's shift gears a little bit here, because your background is so vast in not only nutrition but research and nanotechnology, nutrigenomics. On the nutrigenomics side,
yes,
tell us what your understanding is as it relates to SNPs. Are they, it's my understanding from a researcher on the West Coast out of Stanford, SNPs are basically, they're not defects. They're it's kind of like an adaptability type of thing where it should enhance survivability. There's a reason that SNPs exist. Can you explain a little bit about what a SNP is, why it's important to people, and which ones do we know the most about?
Well, I can tell you, I'll start in reverse. So what we know most about, and I feel the ones that are most published and most respected, are those that have to deal with folic acid metabolism. So it's a single genomic error that could be beneficial or could be deleterious in a gene that shows how a pathway should normally function biochemically. So some people can consume folic acid in their diet. They have our fortified foods. They take a prenatal in the childbearing population. And their doctor's thrilled and says, you're getting all your folate and everything's normal. But without measuring for the presence of a polymorphism, of the ability to utilize folic acid that can be driven by a SNP-based error, you can end up having a patient that looks like they have normal folic acid in their blood, but they actually are not utilizing any of it. And they can, or a very small portion of it. And data shows that that's just a little over 40% of the childbearing population. Another accepted one, but sadly not talked about, is in the conversion of beta-carotene to retinol. There's a polymorphism. When I was looking at data from affluent, healthy women in Germany of childbearing age, 68% of the women that were tested for this polymorphism, that's abnormality to convert beta-carotene to vitamin A, proper vitamin A, were actually not doing that. Now, hold on a second. Vitamin A is essential for a replicating organism. You should not have a very healthy baby in the absence of vitamin A. And if these women are even eating a high beta-carotene diet, and if you look at all the prenatal supplements on the market, the majority of them are beta-carotene rich because people are afraid of vitamin A because it can be a teratogen at specific levels. So what SNP work and polymorphisms and nutrigenomics have done for my life and my research is identify accepted areas. We have to remove a lot of fact from fiction. There's a lot of quasi tests out there that are nutritional based, and they say we can tell you exactly what you should be eating and what dietary supplements you should be taking, but there's really no true basis of academic peer-reviewed science that's been repeated multiple times to show that this is a proper way to live your life. I like the accepted pathways. On
the vitamin A side, just for our listeners, what you're describing is a SNP that would prevent you from converting the beta-carotene, which is a water-soluble form of the vitamin A, into the retinol, which is the fat-soluble form of the vitamin A. And we think of vitamin A particularly as it relates to eyesight, but and of course it is one of the leading causes of blindness, around the world, not necessarily in the United States, but the vitamin A is also very, very important to gut health, right? It's very important for secretory IgA formation to protect as a first line of defense in your gut before an insult enters into your bloodstream to become. So there is a connection between gut health, vitamin A, and perhaps getting tested for this kind of a SNP is a good idea. Do you think?
I do, and I also think one of the things that can be done defensively is designing better prenatals for the target group that's most at risk, right? So I did just that. So I made a prenatal that accepted and understood and is knowledgeable of the teratogenic risks, but also factors in that there's a potential of a large portion of the population where they're most at risk. That rapid cell division requires provitamin A being converted into retinol, and if that's not transpiring, we have a serious problem that can result in some type of genetic abnormality in the child, God forbid, and we cannot have that happen. And of course, the health of the mother. So making sure that the diet is rich in the full form, the retinol form of vitamin A, taking a nutrient to supplement is warranted. For those that cannot run out, see a proper physician to get some type of analysis that shows these true abnormalities. And more are being added on a daily basis. If I could add another one that I've loved for years, it's some people have the inability to take pyridoxine, which is vitamin B6, and convert it into the biological form, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. And if we go back to the brain and all of our originating work in neuroscience and something as simple as in post-concussion syndrome, if your athlete is not doing that, and they have this post-concussion syndrome, or a vet is not converting pyridoxine to pyridoxal 5-phosphate, so many things don't happen. You can't have 5-HTP decarboxylase create serotonin in the absence of P5P where it should be. It just is not going to happen. You can't have the degradation of norepinephrine into epinephrine in any polymorphism of pyridoxal 5-phosphate, of folate metabolism, or of cysteine metabolism, which would be a polymorphism of the glutathione pathway where cysteine is a precursor. Those aforementioned nutrients run the enzyme system, phenylethylamine N-methyltransferase. And that is a critical enzyme that says, hey, norepinephrine, you now become the shorter-lasting stress neurotransmitter norepinephrine. And since this is a straight line of rate-limiting effect, if that enzyme system is broken, what precedes norepinephrine? Dopamine. Hey, wait, don't we need that to focus? And Ben's telling me to do something, and I'm his patient, and I don't know what the hell he's saying, and I can't process it and retain it. If your norepinephrine is maxed, you're not going to make more dopamine because it's not going to be able to convert into norepinephrine. So I was spending years working on normalizing the homeostatic mechanisms of various pathways in the brain, combining knowledge of genetic polymorphisms and nutrigenomics and nanotechnology.
All right, so hold on a second. We're going, I love this, we're going full speed into some really cool areas here, but for our audience, I want to kind of, and again, correct me, Doc, if I'm wrong, but let's just say an audience member is just not going to go and get these types of testing done, but they do want to take good care of themselves when it comes to their nutrition, based on the methylation SNPs and the vitamin A SNPs and the SNPs associated with vitamin B6. Mm-hmm. Then it would just be a good idea to take a vitamin that has methylated folate, to take a vitamin that has the fat-soluble form of the vitamin A as opposed to the beta-carotene. Now, again, I do have to stress that when you take a fat-soluble form of a vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, that fat soluble means there is a toxicity level, and therefore getting good advice on that is probably a good idea. But also if you're going to take a B complex, that it should be a methylated B complex. The B6 should be P5P form, and then maybe you don't have to go and get that kind of testing done.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would just like to add, just to really echo your point, I think everybody who's concerned about the dialogue we're having today should speak to a knowledgeable physician about these topics. I'm hoping that what we're doing is generating awareness of these real critical topics that people are not addressing. And it could save, dare I say it, lives, problems, stressors, anomalies, spina bifida. If someone has a polymorphism of folate and they're not utilizing folate, that is an unbelievable trauma. Cleft palate, as you were talking about blindness in the vitamin A situation or changes in your eye. Look, majoring in biochemistry, every single biochemical reaction in the human body has a nutritional manifestation and a nutritional catalyst. There's no way around that. So I never understood there shouldn't be a disconnect between medicine and nutrition. It should be only a connect. It's smart medicine, right? You can't create cellular energy. For me to flail my arms talking to you guys is adenosine triphosphate. And in the absence of nutrition, I can't manufacture that cellular currency of energy known as adenosine triphosphate. So speak to a knowledgeable practitioner about these concepts, but I hope that this is dialogue for knowledge and for people looking deeper into these topics that are critical.
And understanding how powerful nutrition actually is. And again, speaking to a physician who can properly diagnose what your needs are can save you from countless medical procedures you might need to treat a disease that didn't have to manifest to begin with. So now you're working with nanotechnology and nanomedicine, and I assume that has to do with diagnostics, like you mentioned before about a tiny little camera that you could pee out, which is amazing to me. But where does nanotechnology cross with nutrition?
That's a great point. And first, I'm hoping our audience is familiar, but nanomedicine is just the use of nanotechnology for medical purposes. So that's just throwing that out there. And nanotechnology is working with nanomaterials to develop better methods of single, specific, targeted medical treatment or getting from point A to point B quicker. So one of the most well-known forms of nanotechnology and therefore nanomedicine and how it connects with nutrition is in liposome technology. So I've always been fascinated with the blood-brain barrier because of how protective it is. If we go back to early diagnostics of brain tumors, there was this great frustration and drama of no one being able to treat brain tumors with conventional methods of chemotherapy early on because you couldn't get a therapeutic agent up the blood-brain barrier to actually do its job. And then when that transpired, there were multiple patents that were held. By the way, the author of this zone diet, if you go back in time to that popularity, is a scientist named Barry Sears, who actually was one of the doctors working on getting chemotherapy up the blood-brain barrier. So it's interesting how people in different fields still go back to nutrition because they know how powerful it is. Once you study anatomy, physiology, chemistry, you always have a foot in the nutrition pond. So liposomal technology fascinated me because it's a like substance. To get past the blood-brain barrier, size matters, and also acceptance by the cell structure to be utilized as a friend. Mm-hmm. So using an alien molecule, if I'm going to make a drug and I want to get it past the blood-brain barrier, I have to be really smart. I have to make a drug that has specific cell receptor fake-outs so that it's taken up and utilized in the brain even though it's a foreign molecule. Where I don't have to worry about that is when I'm working with a phosphoglycolipid. And you may say, well, Robert, how could you possibly know that? And I'd say, Dr. G, I'm glad you asked. Mm-hmm. In 1982, in the journal Neurology, there's a really interesting paper, a hypothesis of using liposomes that are in the family of the phosphoglycolipids, such as phosphatidylcholine, and putting the material inside that sphere could pass the blood-brain barrier. And the first theory was, can we get GABA in that? Mm-hmm. And that paper spawned so much interest in my brain that I just would not let it go. and that was my first foray into nanomedicine and liposomal technology. So I developed a nanoliposomal molecule of GABA. So GABA inside phosphatidylcholine liposome that I derived from organic sunflower oil instead of soy, which is the primary crop that's pretty ubiquitous in this country, and stabilize that to be 50 nanometers in size. So there's your nanomedicine component, and the delivery component and the nanotechnology is the liposome. To do something different, use GABA the way our brains kind of intended GABA should be used.
Robert, let me jump in here, and this is so important. I'm so sorry to interrupt you on this. And the reason a lot of people will go into a vitamin shop and purchase, GABA, and they feel they heard somewhere that it has an anti-anxiety effect. It can be helpful for sleeping, etc. And just for our audience, GABA is our only inhibitory neurotransmitter. Not our only, but our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. And there are a lot of drugs that act on the GABA system. Drugs that like Xanax and anti-anxiety types of medications that are actually very addictive, like the benzodiazepine class of drugs. So what people don't realize is that GABA is simply an amino acid, found in food, found in protein, but it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So you can go spend all of your money on GABA supplementation, thinking it's getting into your brain where you want it, but really you're urinating it out within 2 hours, all of it. And so this is important to you because what you're saying is the nanotechnology can carry the GABA molecule across the blood-brain barrier where it can have its anti-anxiety or its inhibitory effect. Am I correct in that analysis?
You are absolutely correct in that analysis, and it's the subject of the next part of a study. So I have a clinical trial going on right now at New York University where I'm using this type of technology in a formula for sleep. So I developed a dietary supplement for NSF for sport, for professional athletes. It's actually in the Winter Olympics right now. It's used by numerous professional hockey teams, baseball teams, football. It's known as Power Off. And inside that is this nanotechnology GABA molecule. And it's in a so I wanted to treat the world of dietary supplements the way someone who comes from pharmaceutical science would. Right? A gold standard, placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blind trial that the manufacturer has nothing to do with other than the inevitable, somebody's got to pay the bill. So that's exactly what I did. I took my baby, not my actual baby. I took the scientific baby.
Your research baby.
My research baby, Power Off, and handed that over to NYU and left the building. So placebos were developed that look identical to the actual substance. The substance and 60 patients have been in this trial since November. So this has been going on. It ends in June, so it's a nice long trial for a dietary supplement company. I'll be honest, many do not do that. So you should really look at how many will do that. It's pretty remarkable. The brands that I respected really didn't do their own gold standard studies. And the second step of that trial that will commence after June will be the GABA tracer, where I'll actually use functional MRI to prove my point. So what we did was use doctors to get empirical evidence to do the opposite of what you saw, right? What you say. Doctors or people will go to their local vitamin shop, GNC, and pick up GABA in a supplement and take it. Maybe they have a negative response that's more excitatory. Maybe they feel nothing. And there's enough data that says that GABA really does not effectively pass the blood-brain barrier. So it was getting past the published hurdles with data that made sense based on publication, right? Going back to that aforementioned 1982 paper on GABA with a phospholipid, and taking that and marrying that with modern technology for nanomedicine and creating a standardization of the size gives us the best feeling that it will work. Threw that in the field and had doctors test it, study it, use polysomnographies, sleep clinics, and ended up getting it endorsed by people like Dr. James Moss from Cornell, and many different for sleep. What I would like to add that I found so fascinating was how much little GABA you actually need when it's encapsulated and it's doing the right thing. And that's kind of when I knew I was on the right path to having this molecule work the way we all wanted it to work, especially in TBI, where, let's just make this really clear, in many cases, there's such an imbalance between glutamate to GABA. Glutamate is converted to GABA. It's supposed to be a normal process in the brain. GABA will last for a finite period of time. It is reduced, it's ameliorated, or we would just be a mess. If we all walked around with tons of GABA, we wouldn't function. And then we have our normal system, and we have this great balance of sleep-wake cycle. In TBI, that does not transpire so well according to clinical data, and the GABAergic neurons are either obliterated, damaged. There's more of an excitatory neurological response, which normally truncates GABA and the VPLO in the brain. So it really was just going after that uphill battle of trying to create normalization of those homeostatic mechanisms in the brain.
Isn't it amazing that the most excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, glutamate, and the most inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, GABA, think of it as, like you said, on and off, right? So, the major on switch and the major off switch have one enzyme that separate them, glutamic acid decarboxylase. And there's, I think, an underdiagnosed number of people with glutamic acid decarboxylase antibodies. GAD65 antibodies actually also has a high correlation with type 1 diabetes, but running that type of an enzyme on somebody with TBI or even somebody with anxiety is probably a good idea.
Absolutely, and trying to do whatever you can to create normalcy of those pathways that are the neurochemical, right? And it's been an uphill battle for all of us. And the technology that's available now are mimickers. So a lot of people are out there and they're using substances that for all intents and purposes are drugs, and not naming names or nothing, but they're quasi out there in the legal landscape of being a dietary supplement, and I use the term legal loosely, but they mimic substances like baclofen. So what they're really doing is they're just binding to GABA A and B receptors, but they're not actually doing anything to address the GABA abnormality. Because if you have some type of, one of the theories that I have, and it's my theory, if you have this damaged GABA system and you're either a fight or flight person or you're a TBI person, and there's this elevated level of glutamate and non-conversion into GABA, and you can't just lay down the next 24 hours. Our bodies love homeostatic mechanisms. If glucose goes low, we're going to break down muscle tissue, strip alanine, send it to the liver, gluconeogenesis transpires, and now I just turned a non-glucose source into pure glucose, and my blood sugar rises. And I didn't even eat a damn thing, right? It's just the sacrifice of my muscle tissue. Well, in the brain, my theory is, then your body, you have to wake up, you have to perform. Now you have an increase in norepinephrine, you have an increase in excitatory neurotransmitters, you have an increase in cortisol, you continue the deleterious suppression of the neurotransmitters that keep things more calm, GABA, serotonergic pathways, and the whole system starts to collapse. So I wanted to address that because you have people like the great Ben Velasquez that's doing what he's doing physiologically, like yourself, Dr. G. I came from, working with Ted and knowing Ted well, and everything that was being done at the Carrick Institute and continues to go on to try to create brain normalcy. I wanted to do my little part. What can be done, but analyzed from a physiological perspective, neurochemical, very, very small nanoscopic scale. Can you make change? And that's what, first I was met, Dr. G, with naysayers. I'll give you the best one. Robert, your product contains 50 micrograms of melatonin. The lowest you could buy over the counter is 1,000 micrograms. Ergo, I already know it doesn't work. And my argument is, wow, you obviously are not a scientist. Because the scientist would say, shit, how could 50 micrograms work?
Right.
I would love to know how that could work. Or does it work? Can I prove this is a failure? Or can I prove this is actually something that could work? And that's what I wanted to do and set out to do. And so far, we're seeing that can work. Nanotechnology can change our modern concept of what a dosage is. And then you can measure physiological change. You can use actographs. You can use, for example, in a conversion pathway for serotonin, you don't have to do a spinal tap. you could look at 5-hydroxyindole acetate, which is an accepted metabolic pathway that says, hey, serotonin was made and metabolized.
Okay, hold on a second, Robert. This is very important to our audience. So kind of go through either where the technology is or where you think it's going as far as biomarkers go for actually looking at neurotransmitter or brain, because the pathways that you went over just a few minutes ago, those we know the pathways exist, but diagnosing actual brain-based imbalances is really theoretical, in nature. And where do you see the technology going to make it more of a reality?
And part two of the question, Robert, sorry to interrupt, but I just didn't want to forget this. Part two to Dr. G's question is that what strikes me as most important to pull out of this conversation for our audience is that the work that you're doing is going to lead to a way that we can look at biochemical markers and determine what that athlete or that person's tolerance to work is. And that's important because up to this point, it's a guessing game. And now they're using different data points to kind of guess, but this to me, and Dr. G and I had this conversation yesterday relative to a TBI athlete that we have, and what is that particular person's tolerance to work at this stage in the game, and how can we improve that, and what does their neurochemistry tell us where they are right now?
Yeah, and these are great questions, and unfortunately, I'm also going to be a bearer of bad news for a moment, coming from the research and side of things, which is so refreshing being out of the practicing environment, because it's where my heart is, but it is a slow-moving wheel, and right now the diagnostics are not there. You can't just simply get a approved FDA diagnostic data by looking at neurotransmitter analyses and say X, Y, and Z. So you have to combine multiple pathways that are accepted, like the aforementioned Dr. Goel, who was a fantastic professor of mine at Rutgers University in his phenomenal brain research, where he was comparing Alzheimer's disease and concussion work and looking at the visual aspect using biomedical informatics. Better visualization gives us better outscope, which then gives us better targets for biological markers that we can then put a package together. So Ben, where's the future headed? I could tell you some really cool things, man. I got a pretty cool concept where you could do a finger prick and in 15 minutes be able to say that guy had a TBI, get him off. He's concussed.
Yeah, because they just pulled a study.
Is that the SB100 protein, or?
That's one of them, but there's an even better, more rapid way, because that tells us that we have leaky blood-brain barrier, but that just opens the floodgates. And again, using biomedical informatics, you can see many, many more things, and it opens your door open to a greater ability to test on a smaller scale.
Well, we're going to be following up with you then as this technology starts to come out. We're going to be following up with you more and more. I mean, this conversation can go in so many different directions, right, Ben? I mean,
yeah, and I mean, there's so many things covered. I have so many notes here, and Robert will definitely have you on again. But for our listeners, right now, if you're a listener and you're concerned, well, listen, what kind of testing can I get done now? I want to thrive, whether I be a weekend warrior or I'm a high-level athlete. I want to thrive now. Right now, February 2018, what's available to me now that I can test? Because I can't rely on a medical practitioner on understanding what needs to be done. What can I get done on my own?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. I can tell you when I was in practice at the time, I'd like to think I was extremely cutting edge, and I was looking at organic acid analyses and just full blood panels of everything you could measure that was accepted and CLIA licensed laboratories. Mm-hmm. So back in the days, there were labs like Metametrics that had certain tests, but at other tests it wasn't approved. So I really had to do like a hodgepodge to stick things together. Now I'm not ashamed to say, because science moves so quickly, is I retired in December of 2013. Mm-hmm. And in the world of science, that is an insane long. We're looking at now in 2018, and we're like, my God, this is that's 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. The lab that I mentioned was acquired by a completely different lab. So what do I say in that type of environment? I'll be honest, I don't get that question often because I spend my time working with PhDs and doctors in the research field, mm-hmm. particularly when I'm at the colloquium at Rutgers or I'm anywhere in a lab doing that type of work. It's more developing the next tests that doctors will have is what we do, and getting analyses. I actually push to accredited organizations that have physicians that do this type of work. And one of the ones I'm not paid by, I'm not wed to, I'm not even a member of, is the Institute for Functional Medicine. Mm-hmm. I like their work for many reasons, but here's my top reasons. They spawned the doctors that were given the ability to run the integrated functional medicine clinic at the Cleveland Clinic. And that to me says, you're accepted, you're accredited, we believe in you, we adopt your thinking and your philosophy. So that's reason one. When a large body says, they didn't go to the other organizations, and there's many of them, right? They went to that organization. The second reason is it was started by one of my chemistry heroes, the great Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Jeff Bland is a PhD in chemistry, not in anything that's fringe science. This guy is a straight-laced chemist who, as I said multiple times during this discussion, if anyone seriously studies on a master's to doctoral level the chemistry sciences, human biochemistry, nutrigenomics, you cannot escape the essence and the importance of nutrition and how it's responsible for all functioning. So on the Institute for Functional Medicine website, back in 2013, I'm assuming it's still there was literally a find a practitioner. And I would say to the listeners, you know what? These are great accredited physicians that hopefully could steer you in the right way. If that wasn't something that could be done and there was the ability to go even further, I would pick that organization, the Cleveland Clinic, and just go right to their integrated program where you know you can get the most cutting edge soup to nuts testing done under one umbrella and have all those great minds to try to analyze optimization.
We're going to have to put all of that in the show notes. And for our listeners out there, you can go to the Thrivalistmanifesto.com website where you'll be able to find the show notes. You'll be able to subscribe to our podcast. You'll be able to download the podcast, share with your friends. We encourage you to share, write reviews, tell us what you like, what you don't like, whether or not Ben says and too many times.
Which I do.
Please feel free to do so because this podcast is going to grow exponentially because of the relationships that we have with people like Dr. Pastore, who's really just a wealth of information clinically and academically, and that's so important.
That's
because
important.
The ability to be able to communicate with a person and what they're experiencing is so rare in the research community, and you have that. You have years of experience working with people and also taking this great research environment that you have access to at Columbia and Rutgers, and all of the authors and people who are just on the cutting edge here. So you are definitely going to be a regular contributor to our podcast. We really look forward to that. And like I said, we can keep going, but time is definitely not on our side.
We should do a part two.
We should definitely do a part two.
Absolutely. But I want our listeners to know where they can find products that you formulated, media that you're a part of. Where can people find out more about Dr. Robert Pastore? And
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And that's actually being built because I'm such a geek in a lab, but we do have some decent resources. So if everybody would draw their attention to the parent company, I started a company after I left clinical practice in 2013 called Vitalere, Vitalere. So if you go to that, by the way, that's the two root Latin words for nourish life. So I had to keep science even in my biotech company. So Vitalere is this growing biotech company that has a strong nutritional arm. And if anyone has time to go to Vitalere.com, you can see my ugly mug and the people behind me, which are way more impressive than I am. on my board with the work we're doing, and we're going to be adding so many more researchers and scientists there. And from that homepage, you can be spawned into some products that I developed that are based on all my research and technology. Every one of my products will be going through and already have planned the double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized human trials at major universities that I have no part in, other than, like it or not, it's the way the world runs. My board finances it. And when anyone ever says there's no data on nutrition, I would love to hand them the bill for the NYU trial and tell them if they would love to raise that six-figure fee for a 60-patient trial for a nutritional startup arm of their parent company. So yeah, so no, I thank you so much for that, and that is you're very, very kind for saying that.
And Robert, being a big Rush fan, and Neil Peart is not only the drummer for Rush, but he's also the lyricist. He's the one who writes the songs, and if you know the words, the creativity, and he kind of has a mind that's similar to yours. So
can I leave you with an anecdote on that?
Sure.
A fun story, please?
Yeah.
Since you're a fan and I can share that. So I idolized Mr. Peart, and I wish I could go back in time. I didn't fully pay attention, which is so not like me if you know me well. Academically, I'm glued. So I met Neil Peart when I was just turned 18 years old at the Buddy Rich Memorial Scholarship at the Ritz in New York City. Now, keep in mind, Neil Peart wrote the following words: "I cannot pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend." And that lyric, I come to learn, was about, through reading all of his books, was about his inability to just see a stranger that loved him because of what he did on his lyric writing or his ability to play drums. He just couldn't accept that. He would say, "I love Keith Moon, but I didn't stalk him." So he would never be comfortable with fans. I ran up to Mr. Peart and regurgitated my love all over his body and told him why I loved him so much and how much he was the reason, and how I memorized every note to his drum solo, and I could play it, and I could score Red Barchetta. But guess what? I didn't pay attention to his lyrics. So he was a gentleman. He shook my hand, and he bolted as fast as the conversion of 5-hydroxytryptophan to sodium.
So Red Barchetta is my favorite song when it comes to the imagery of Rush music. You could listen to that song and actually see the movie or the music video being created. It really isn't. Anyway, we could geek out on Rush for hours too. Now, where
my nanoliposome while listening to the second half of Cygnus X1. Please drop the needle on that second half, and that was my brain's orchestra for that. And you will get it when you remind that.
That's great.
Take you down memory lane on that.
So, Robert, where in Queens are you from?
Born and raised in Howard Beach, Queens.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm born and raised in Flushing, and a graduate of Francis Lewis High School, and we had many
Adams.
Okay, yeah, but we had quite a few Howard Beach students. Actually, the ones who got run out of your school were sent to Francis Lewis. So
absolutely, yeah. I almost got thrown out of Catholic school for writing a paper on Darwin. So yeah,
that wouldn't go well.
Scientific troublemaker from the onset. Yes.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time and your generosity with your knowledge, and we will have you on our show again.
We will definitely have you on our show again, and for the listeners, it's vitalair.com, and we thank you.
Yeah, and that is the end of our episode of the Thrivalist Manifesto with Ben V and Dr. G. Have a great day.